It's math. It's just not my favorite thing. Hey there, everybody. Now, there are actually going to be 2 LGBTQ plus representation videos this month. Kind of, because this one here is a follow-up to last month's what I did on the Bury Your Gays trip, because I realized not long after the video went up, there was an aspect of that that's actually really important that I completely forgot to cover. And I debated whether or not it was worth a whole nother video, and yeah, kinda is. So this is supplementary to that previous video, so I would recommend checking that out if you haven't already. But I'll also mention that this particular video is sponsored by the Radio vs. the Martians podcast. It's a panel show where hosts Mike Gillis and Casey Dorn talk about all manner of nerdy things, from Batman to wrestling to vigilante entertainment to Planet of the Apes, and of course, every single film Arnold Schwarzenegger was ever in. They have on guests, they talk about all kinds of things. They're funny, they're fun, they're sometimes even insightful. Radio vs. the Martians at radioversusthemartians.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So, the thing that I forgot to talk about has to do with basically the queer mortality rate in films. Now, you might look back at my Bury Your Gays video and go, wasn't that what the entire thing was about? Well, sort of, but there's a specific thing that I really should have drilled in on. And actually, it bugged me so much that I picked the comment that was left on the video that pointed out what I failed to most succinctly and pinned it as the top comment on that video. But now I'm going to talk about it more specifically here. Now, I don't run numbers a ton if I can help it, especially if I am able to just find that someone has already done that for me. And when I say run the numbers, it's come up in videos that I've done, like Harry Potter and the Heteronormative Standard, or it came up ages ago in a Doctor Who video that I did talking about the companion character of Bill, and things like that where I really want to back things up with data. It's not my favorite thing to do, and it's also just not in general how my head tends to work. So if I don't go out of my way to look up numbers, I don't always think to do that. And the other cases where I have, the numbers were very central to the point I was making. In this case, talking about Bury Your Gays, it's an element of it and a big one, but it wasn't the overall point, so I missed it. Now, when I say run the numbers, what numbers am I talking about? Well, theoretically, there'd be 2 sets of numbers, one of which I am not even going to bother with, because the amount of research I'd have to do to try and cover that, I don't have the time. I just don't. So what I'm not going to touch in is what percentage of films in which queer characters appear have those characters die. That I'm not even going to tackle, because trying to figure out all the films and TV shows or whatever that have these kinds of characters at all, and calculating ones where they die versus ones where they don't, and trying to parse all that out, and then trying to figure out, well, what do we count as mainstream versus niche entertainment? Do we weigh everything the same? I'm not touching that. What I am going to tackle instead is films in which a gay character dies. Films and TV. I'll be doing both. What percentage of the queer population of that film just got killed? Because more often than not, whenever a gay, trans, queer, or otherwise LGBTQ plus character is killed in a film or TV show that they appear in, that is usually more than 50% of the queer population of that film or show or comic or whatever. Now, why does this even matter at all? Well, it kind of feeds into the point that I was making before about the nature of how often you see this. And a part of what makes it hit harder when the bury your gays trope is sort of put into play is the fact that it's not just that you're killing a gay character, you're killing the vast, majority population of the gay characters in this story. Sometimes even 100% of the gay characters. And that really does increase the impact of the times this trope gets used. And it's something that I wish I'd addressed. So, I'm going to do that now. So, I have run a few different sets of numbers. And I am also going to talk about films separate from TV. Because TV has kind of its own little wonky X factors going on with them. But as far as films go, here's how things are going to break down. In the films or film franchises that I talk about, I am going to be telling you, here are the gay characters, here's how many die, what was the percentage. Now, in some cases, you are not going to get a straight percentage. So, like, for example, let's pick a nice easy example. Brokeback Mountain, 2 gay characters, Enos, Jack. Jack dies, Enos lives, 50% mortality rate for Brokeback Mountain. Sounds easy, right? Well, it is, but things get a little bit more complicated in some instances because I would call them, in some cases, arguable. In some instances on film, it is arguable either as to whether or not a character definitely died or if we're simply dealing with an implied death, or whether or not a character who did die was definitely gay, if that was only implied. So in cases like that, I will give a range, basically saying, look, here's the math for the maximum mortality rate and the minimum mortality rate. So I'll actually open up with an example of that. And that would be Rent. So Rent, both the play and the film, the gay population of that film, either gay or bisexual, well, or transgender, depending on what you consider Angel to be, but it's Angel, Collins, Joanne, and Maureen. Joanne and Maureen live, Angel dies, Collins is still alive at the end of the story, but he also has an AIDS diagnosis, and particularly at the time the thing is set, that is a death sentence. So what I would say on that one, it is arguable. So that one makes it a mortality rate of 25 to 50%. So sort of laying that out the way I have, let's start just running some numbers. Well, how about one of the big ones? Harry Potter, if we take J.K. Rowling's word that Dumbledore is in fact gay, that means that this franchise has a queer mortality rate of 100%. Even if we assume that Grindelwald is also queer, he gets killed as well, and that's in the final films. Is it the 7th or 8th? One of those, but he dies too, so that's still a 100% mortality rate, even if we add in Grindelwald, which is arguable. Philadelphia, I'm calling that one 50% because even though there is, say, a party and a group of queer and gay characters that are seen, none of them are named. They're effectively extras. As far as named characters go, we have 2. One of them dies, 50% mortality rate there. V for Vendetta, that's probably reasonably 100% if you want to be super generous. Gordon, we don't actually see get killed, so 50%, realistically 100%. Kiss of the Spider-Woman, either 50 or 100%. I would call it 100%. It's 50% depending on what you consider Raul Julia's character to be, whether or not you consider him to be gay or straight. Even though the relationship he has is with a character played by a man who is biologically male, it's also a character who identifies as a woman. That makes his attractions to the female. I would still consider him to be straight, but if you don't and you want to consider him to be a gay man, that's still a 50% mortality rate, so we've got 50 to 100 on that one. Cloud Atlas, 2 queer characters, both dead, 100% mortality rate. A Single Man, from 33 to 50%, depending on what you think about Kenny towards the end, because it's implied, but that's not a 100% certainty. Even if we have him in and the low end is 33%, one of the 2 surviving gay characters does spend literally the entire movie contemplating suicide. Beginners, 50% mortality rate. Rocky Horror Picture Show, one of my favorites. So many deprived characters, must have a huge cast. Actually, when we're talking specifically queer characters, it's much smaller. There's Frank, there's Rocky, there's Brad, and maybe, arguably, there's Eddie. We know Frank had an attraction to Eddie, but because of the nature of Eddie's place in the story, we don't know for certain whether that was ever reciprocated from Eddie towards Frank. So that means we're either dealing with 66% or 75%. It's high in either case. Pulp Fiction. I bet you're thinking, there were gay characters in Pulp Fiction. Yes, there were. There was Zed and Maynard and the Gimp. Well, also depends on how we want to calculate this one out. Maynard's definitely dead. Zed, while not killed to our eyes, as the audience, it's made very clear that he is going to be dead. The Gimp gets knocked unconscious. If we are super generous, maybe they don't kill him if they assume that he is unwilling to this, except he seemed willing, and Marcellus Wallace seems like he's really gonna take them all apart. So I would call that 100% mortality rate, at best 66%. So far, we haven't had a single film in which a gay character dies that I've cited so far. And again, I'm not trying to cherry pick these. These are the ones that I could definitely find or think of and we haven't had one that was inarguably below 50% for the mortality rate. The ones that were below 50%, it was a range. It was arguable. Could I find any where a queer character died and it killed inarguably less than 50% of the queer cast? Yes. You're not going to believe what it was. It was Basic Instinct. There's 3 queer characters in that. There's Roxy, there's Beth, and of course there's Catherine. Roxy dies, the other 2 live. 33% mortality rate on that one. We are looking at an overall mortality rate of 53 to 68%, meaning if you are going to a film in which a queer character dies, odds are that's going to be more than half the queer population of that film that you have to watch get decimated. And I'll also point out, it's pretty common that when we lose 50%, the surviving half is one half of a couple, which means the surviving half is in mourning. So they're suffering too. Now, I did exclude from this list anything based off a true story because obviously, the creative input isn't as much at play there. If this is what happened, that's the story they're going to tell. So I felt like that was going to be stacking the deck. That said, there was something I noticed taking a quick peek at films that are queer films based off true stories. A surprisingly large number of them opt to tell stories where the gay character dies, or even the ones where that's not the case. It's pretty common for them to, in the ending text scrawl, to explicitly lay out how they died. So some films that do that would include Milk, Boys Don't Cry, Before Night Falls, Dallas Buyers Club, The Danish Girl, Behind the Candelabra, Frida, Can You Forgive Me, and The Imitation Game. That, I didn't know how to quantify that pattern, but I noted it, and it felt like something that should be pointed out. So let's get to TV. Now, TV has additional complications on top of the ones I already mentioned about some characters sometimes being arguable. Either their death being arguable or their status as being queer being arguable. The additional complication in television is whether or not you want to count single appearance characters or if you are only going to account for recurring characters. So most of the numbers I've run on television shows were only on recurring characters, because trying to track down whether or not a gay character appeared in a one-off episode of this, that, or the other, just again, I don't have the time or the means at this point to be able to pull that off. So instead, I'm going to focus on main characters with one exception. There is one show that I know well enough off the top of my head. If you follow this channel, you might even guess what one it is, where I actually am going to break that down, but I'm going to save that towards the end. But even beyond this, there are additional complications, which I'll mention as we go along. So why don't we talk about one of the ones that I talked about in the previous Bury Your Gays video. Let's talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So, in Buffy, confirmed queer characters, we have Larry, Willow, Tara, Kennedy. Larry dies, Tara dies. That is a 50% mortality rate. But this also allows me to bring in the other wrinkle when it comes to television, which is that when I'm looking at these percentages, I'm looking at the total run of the show, assuming it's ended. But at the time they happen, that percentage may be a lot worse. So with Buffy, at the time Larry died, he was the only confirmed gay character of the show. So at the time they killed him at the end of season 3, that gave the show a 100% gay mortality rate. Then we established Willow as being gay or bisexual. Some people prefer. She identifies as gay, but, I'll acknowledge that anyway. And then Tara, so that meant they'd only lost a third, and mortality dropped down to 33% until they killed Tara, and suddenly jumps up to 66 until they introduced Kennedy. Now it's back down to 50. So you need to kind of decide for yourself whether later padding out things makes that earlier one okay. And sort of the main reason this occurred to me was looking at the 100, because this was something that came up a lot in the comments section of the previous video, people mentioning Lexa. Now, I haven't watched the 100, so I don't have full context about this, but from what I could find out, Lexa, at the time the character died, represented 50% of the queer population of that series. More gay characters have been introduced since then, but at the time she died, that was 50% gone. What else have we got? Well, there's Torchwood. For the dead side of things, we have Yanto, Owen, and Tosh. And surviving, we have Jack Harkness and John Hart. Lost is another one worth looking at just quickly in terms of that, do we count one-off characters? Because the only confirmed recurring character who was not straight in that show was Tom. He died. That gives the show a 100% mortality rate for queer characters. However, technically, other queer characters did appear in 2 instances in flashback sequences, meaning basically as background information once. If you include them, the mortality rate drops to 33%, but can we agree that that's a really generous interpretation? So that's kind of why I didn't really want to deal too much with one-off appearances, except for the time that I do. And like I said, I'll get back to that because there is another wrinkle when it comes to talking about TV shows that I'm going to use that to introduce. This whole thing is obviously way less structured than the last one was, if you couldn't tell. So, Voltron, 50% mortality rate. And now we come to Doctor Who, the one that I am going to run in 2 different ways. Firstly, the way that I have been running it. So, dead, we have Heather, Bill, and River Song. And surviving, we have Jenny, Vastra, and maybe Jack Harkness. Here's your arguably, because I think it's debatable whether Jack Harkness counts as a example of barrier gaze or a rebuke of barrier gaze. It's possible he might actually exist as both. So I'm going to give the range on this and give Jack the ability to just go back and forth and, do whatever he wants. So that means that Doctor Who, when looking at recurring queer characters, has a mortality rate of between 50 and 66%. Now, when I look at one-off appearing queer characters, that does complicate things a bit more. It adds in, on the dead side of things, Sky Silvestri, Oswin, the Fat One, the assistant from Arachnids in the UK, and that one random guard from Resolution. Meanwhile, over on Surviving, it adds in the sort of servant from Unicorn and the Wasp, the Thin One, and Alonzo. Alonzo. So, putting these on board and also taking into account Jack, I have to account for both ways, so this is going to be a range again. This actually makes it worse. This makes it a 60 to 66% range. But also, I'm going to illustrate the one other thing, because when looking at a TV show, you need to decide if you are going to look at the show overall or each individual episode. Now, if you're doing something serialized, maybe you want to deal with it one way. If you're doing something episodic, maybe you want to do it the other. But, for example, in a lot of the instances of the single appearance, like, say, Midnight, the character of Sky Silvestri, confirmed as gay, does die, and she makes up, in that specific episode, 100% of the queer characters in that story. So even though the show itself might have counting characters that are like Sky, who appear only one time, a 60 to 66% mortality rate, that specific episode has a 100% mortality rate. So again, the reason that I wanted to bring all these numbers up is I think one of the rebukes to why we shouldn't even care about bury your gays as a thing is that, look, characters die. Characters die in all kinds of stories, and all kinds of characters do. What does this matter? Well, I talked a lot about that sort of thing in general in the previous video, but I did kind of fail to mention the fact that we're not just watching a gay character die. Oftentimes we're watching the gay character die. Or half of the gay population of a film die. And the instances where it was less than half were really small. And even those were often arguable. So when people who are cisgender or straight try and think to themselves like, well, it doesn't bother me when, a straight white guy dies in a film. Well, okay, no, but what if half of all the straight white guys died? What if half of all the women died? And not just in a film, in film after film after film after film, minimum half died. Because, look, let's be honest, the instances I found where it was less than 50, they kind of feel like flukes. So, how would it feel going into a film, seeing a character that bears a striking resemblance to you in some key way, a way that you don't always see depicted in stories, and you feel like you might as well flip a coin as to whether or not they live? And if they do die, maybe they were it, or they were half. And that's why that's another reason, in addition to everything else I already talked about, why this stuff hits harder than like maybe some people think it should, looking at it on paper. But the numbers matter. I wish I had run them when I did the previous video. Realistically, though, if I had, it would have been way more condensed. It also would have been more structured. I would have scripted it properly, so maybe it would have worked better. In any case, here's me spitting numbers at you, revisiting that topic, because of a pretty hefty omission. So whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. If you want to help support me and help me pay my bills and help make this better, there's also a Patreon down there. I've also started putting a link for PayPal tip jar if you want to do one-time support. That's wonderful as well. Plus, there's a whole bunch of other stuff down there. There's links to my socials, link to my book, P.O. box address, etc., etc., etc. So check them out or don't. I am not going to tell you what to do. I'll suggest, I'll hope, but I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to demand, because at the end of the day, folks, you are beautiful, you are loved, you are valid, you are the council, and I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.